Sweet baby Jesus, Higherside Chatters, drinking a little drink, smoking a little smoke. Back in my comfort zone of sunny San Diego, I'm Greg Carlwood, and it is good to be back in the saddle after a little more than 2 weeks in Armenia with a tour group led by Graham Hancock, checking out ancient sites that get no respect, and man, it was a serious blast. And also, some of you might have heard me on Chris Jericho's podcast, Talk is Jericho. That was a lot of fun. You know, I had his poster on my wall when I was a kid. Now he's interviewing me about conspiracies. And it was a great spike in new listeners, but also, as many of you know, the main THC site was hit by a denial of service attack. They're fairly common, but this was the first time it's happened to me, and I was out of the country, and I was just on one of the biggest podcasts I'd ever been on. But it's all good now. You know, I moved on to a better host, made some updates, and everything seems to be golden. I got a lot of messages worried that something serious had happened, and I'm not going to be one of these hosts who tries to make it a bigger deal or more dramatic than it is. I won't say I was targeted or anything, I don't know. Although the timing couldn't have been much worse for me. Some people thought it was a ploy to get THC Plus signups by disabling the regular site. Other people thought it was mighty suspicious that it was the free site that hit and the Plus was fine. And I get it. We've all been burned by 1,000 scams under the sun. You can't trust anyone when money's involved. But the simple truth is, they're just two different websites. The Plus show is far more secure, and the basic show is just the most obvious thing to attack. Who knows if this person even knew there was a Plus site at all, or if it was even personal. I don't know, but I can confirm that taking my site down at a time when I wanted it up more than anything was not some roundabout money-making scheme from me. That said, I'm pretty happy with today's show. It's one of those fun ones, just a bunch of unusual stories, disappearances, areas of strange energy, underground entities, ley lines, skinwalkers, haunted woods. We gotta grease the wheels here, people, and Steph Young, what a great guest to help me do it. She writes about the cases you haven't yet heard, knows her Rolodex of reality-binding anecdotes, and why not just get into the action? Here's the plate scrapers priming us for takeoff, and I'll be taking your tickets on the other side with Steph Young.
Pack it and park it, tune in and spark it, 'cause Greg's about to open up your mind. Armed with information about the secret manipulation and the wisest aficionados he can find. And he's pulling back the curtain on what we thought we knew for certain, so we can see the world with a brand new set of eyes. You're listening to the Higher Side. Chats.
All right, people, we know the world is full of strangeness, from cryptid encounters and ET experiences to mysterious disappearances, occult rituals, and tales of time travel. And I love it all. Luckily, so does today's guest, all the way from London. Her name is Steph Young, and she's a dedicated researcher and author of nearly a dozen books on all sorts of fringy goodness. Haunted places, missing people, demon encounters, conspiracies, time travel, cryptids, and many other ingredients in the THC soup. So many great stories in so little time, so let's get the party started. Steph, welcome to THC.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. I've heard some great interviews from you before, and your books are very rapid fire, which of course I love. And I suppose the biggest thread that connects the stories we're going to talk about is odd cases of missing people. And really, it's just been in the past year or two that these types of stories have gotten on my radar. And I think it's really intermixing with ufology, cryptozoology, reports of underground bases, all sorts of topics that maybe were once a bit more segregated. Do you kind of get that impression too?
Yeah, the thing that I found was that when I started looking into what was going on in forests and mountainous areas, and I kind of started off because I was writing a book on time travel, and I was finding places where people were possibly disappearing into dimensions. But as I looked into that, it seemed that it perhaps was dimensions, but it also could have been because there was paranormal sightings there, but it was also a hotspot for UFOs, and there was also ley lines there, and it seemed that, you know, the minute you sort of thought it was down to one reason, you'd find these other different reasons, and sometimes they interlinked and sometimes they didn't, and it's really mysterious because you can't put your finger on what actually might be going on. It just sort of one thing leads you to look into another thing.
I totally agree with you. There's so many mysteries and so many possibilities. I mean, I think when you hear some of the unexplainable details to some of the stories you write about, you got to start entertaining some of the wilder explanations. And I guess to get this ball rolling, I know I probably gave you notes on way more than we'll even be able to get to, but in one of your books, Mysterious Things in the Woods, you kick it off by talking about a place called Clapham Woods, which I had never really heard much about. Maybe you can tell us about some of the strangeness that's occurred there.
Sure. It's Clapham Woods, and it's down near Worthing in West Sussex, down on the coast of England. And back in the 60s, actually, the Fortean Times magazine, it started writing about the woods there because they had a lot of UFO sightings. And there were reports from ramblers and hikers, and they seemed to be going into the woods there, and they were having sensations of maybe feeling like they were being watched or followed, and some would be having nausea and migraines and stomach cramps, and other people would be coming out with scratches on them. And then dogs started disappearing, and there was a church warden there called David Bennett, and he used to love recording the sound of nightingales. And he noticed that he couldn't record anymore because they'd all disappeared. And there was on the A27 road, which is the main road that goes along the woods. I mean, it's not a massive woods, but the main road that drove along there, drivers were saying that they were becoming overwhelmed by this force that seemed to be kind of getting hold of the steering wheel and trying to pull it out of their hands, and seeing these strange mists. And then there was a series of deaths that occurred in the 70s, and the first one was in 72, and it was an ex-Marine commando, and he was a policeman now, and he was called Peter Goldsmith. And he was a really fit rambler and hiker, and he wasn't really an easy target, but he was found hidden under the bushes there about 6 months later, and the verdict was that it was an open verdict. They couldn't really rule out what had happened. And then an older man who was 75, Leon Foster, and he was found 3 weeks after he disappeared by a couple who were actually looking for their missing horse. So their horse had gone as well. But the coroner said in his case that the rate of acceleration in which he'd decomposed was far more than would have been expected for 3 weeks. And he actually ruled it as unknown factors. And actually that's really reminiscent to the Todd Sees case. I don't know if you've heard of that one, but I think it was first broke by Linda Moulton Howe and Peter Davenport of MUFON.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, that was a case in America, and he was found a day after he went missing. His house was down the base of Northumberland County, Montauk Ridge in Pennsylvania. So he'd disappeared. He hadn't come home from a pre-season deer spotting. And they searched for him, and the next day they saw something white in the undergrowth by a pond by the house, and they searched in through it. They used cutting equipment to get into it, and they found his body, but it was really emaciated, which you wouldn't expect, for missing for one day.
Right.
It would normally be bloated. And he was actually pretty much undressed. His boot was found in a tree about a mile away, and there was no scent around his ATV. So that was a really mysterious case. It was another one, really, where they couldn't work out how did he get into that state. But going back to the Clapham Woods, so then a vicar was found, a reverend, and he was out in the open, so it was almost as though he'd been taken away and put back there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last case was a woman. She was homeless and she was found murdered. So that was a clear case of what had happened there, and a local man was arrested, but he was put in prison for all of the murders. But they didn't really add up because the other three had been open verdicts. But it's really impossible to find any more information about those cases. But Charles Walker and Toy Newton wrote a book about it, and Charles Walker he joined a UFO group there because he had a feeling, well, this has all got to be down to UFOs, because of the sightings.
Mm-hmm.
And he put in information in the newspapers, requests for information of sightings and witnesses. And a man phoned him up, he said, and he said, I'll meet you in the woods and I'll tell you all about it. And he met him in the dark, and he didn't see the man. The man was sort of behind the trees, and the man said to him, we are the friends of Hecate. And Hecate is the goddess of witchcraft. And he was a really well-spoken man, and he said, you shouldn't meddle in these things, just leave us alone. He said, I've really got, high-powered connections here that you just wouldn't want to become involved with. So that's kind of what happened there. And I suppose the interesting thing is that Alistair Crowley said years and years ago that Clapham Woods is linked by ley lines to a place called Chanctonbury Ring and Sisbury Ring, which are old Iron Age forts. So in his opinion, it was a place of great power because it had the mystical triangle of ley lines. And actually, in the last book I did, I've really gone into detail about how ley lines could possibly be manipulated. There's a guy called David Gowan, and he's said, it doesn't really matter in a way whether you believe that they can be manipulated, but these sources of energy under the earth that you can't see, and in fact you can only really douse them if you are able to do that. I mean, I couldn't do it. But his opinion was that these could be deliberately blackened so that negative energy can be stored there by occultists and used to sort of harness this negative energy grid. You know, and it goes even deeper in a way because there's a numerologist called L.S.C. Taylor, and he's tied in the ley lines to abductions of missing children, and says it's a satanic ritualized kind of, you know, thing.
Yeah.
But, you know, so you can go miles down that route, looking at that. But, you know, in terms of what was going on there, you know, who knows, because they had apparitions of black masses and shadows and all sorts of things as well. So it's really mysterious. It's like a place in Ireland called the Ballybolly, which is an old, it's supposed to be an old druid entrance to the other world. And ancient texts there speak about people going missing. And a man was found there in 2002, but he died of natural causes. But there's no real reason why he died. It was the summertime. There was nothing really to have caused his death. But there were reports in the newspapers in the 90s about there were 2 or 3 cases, and a couple of people had gone in there and they'd heard a woman scream. So they'd gone to try and find out where she was and what was wrong with her, and they couldn't see anybody there. So they turned to leave, but they sort of looked behind them and they said that they saw these black hooded figures, and they heard this flapping as if it was a large bird, and it looked like the trees were surrounded and covered in blood. So
Wow.
you know, and there's a place there. They've got some ancient stones, and the vegetation won't grow around them. It's almost like the park rangers don't have to do any of the maintenance there. So, you know, I could go on. There are so many strange places. There really are.
Yeah, I mean, that's really odd, and I've looked at this stuff for most of my life out of just general interest, but the stories that involve ritual spaces for satanic cults, or the idea that ley lines increase the possibility of paranormal activity or the energetic potency of some of the things that magicians might be doing, I think that's really compelling. That's a great possibility for why some of these things occur generally in the same areas or even on the same parallels. I've heard a lot about the 33rd parallel being a big thing in this context too.
Yeah, I put that in something in the woods, actually. There was a case of the Jameson family who'd gone missing. And I mean, I didn't come up with it, but I'd found a news article about it by a sort of non-mainstream journal, and it was saying how that they were, killed in an area that was the 33rd degree north, which is supposed to be the occult line of power. But going back to the ley lines, there was an investigator who spent about 20 years studying it, and he found, in his opinion, from the sightings and the contactee experiences just in England, he'd said that 95% of them seemed to occur on these lines of power. And he also said, as did David Cowan, that the positive contactee experiences happened on the more natural energy lines, but the ones that they believed had been blackened. As an example, there was a case in 84, I think it was, in a place called Todmorden in the north of England, and a man had gone missing in the village, and he was found on the top of a coal mine, on a coal pile in a coal mine. But his clothes had been done up wrong, and his shirt was missing, and he had a strange set of marks, burning marks on his shoulders, and an ointment that the forensic scientists couldn't identify. And the policeman who actually went to assist, and when they found him, he then went on to have a strange experience himself, because a few nights later they were looking for some missing cows, and they disappeared from a field, and he saw these bright lights coming towards him in the dark, and he thought it was maybe a bus or a truck, but he couldn't get out the car, and his radio equipment stopped working, and then about half an hour later he realised he'd lost half an hour. And he looked at his boots, and they had been split open at the bottom as if he'd been dragged along the road. And he went for some hypno-regression to try and work out what the heck had gone on. And he said that he was taken into a room, and there was a hooded figure and a huge black dog and these little robotic-type creatures. Well, Mark Gibbons, years later, then went and found that actually that village itself had a reputation for witchcraft. So, in his opinion, well, they blackened the area there. But I don't know. It's It's quite compelling. I wrote a lot about the Isle of Wight and ley lines because that's the most haunted island in the world, apparently. I know it quite well, and that's supposed to be crisscrossed with them, you know. And then you've got David Icke who lives there, and he's really of that opinion that actually these are ritually used, and they even put actual buildings for that purpose on those lines to generate the power. But yeah, I mean, it's quite compelling. I don't know whether I go along that route or not, really.
Yeah, I've never really heard quite that explanation that there could be a connection geographically from positive ET experiences to certain ley lines and then negative experiences on other ones. I mean, that's pretty new as far as I'm concerned, but I think it could make a lot of sense. I mean, it all seems to be about energy, and there seems to be a polarity to energy, a positive or negative, and I guess that would open up different doorways to different types of beings. I mean, I don't know. It does seem possible.
I think it does, yeah. And it seems almost as if they're drawn to that energy, you know, whether it's UFO visits or whether it's paranormal. There's a scientist, Dr. Robert Sosh, and he was on Mount Kailash in Tibet, which is possibly where Shambhala is, isn't it? I mean, I don't know. And Hitler was quite interested in that mountain, wasn't he? But he went there apparently, and they were just meditating on the top of it, and it was dark, and he saw this sudden flash of light, and these figures suddenly materialized. But that was a place that is supposed to be a hotspot for UFOs. So if they're drawn to that energy, as were people like Hitler looking for that energy source. You know, there seems to be a lot to do with this energy, doesn't it? This invisible energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also I love a good cryptid story, and you have quite a few of those in the books. And this one that was pretty new to me, I'd never heard before, was the Beast of Exmoor. What happened here? What do we know about this beast?
Well, I think in terms of this one, I think really is in terms of a big cat as opposed to paranormal. So I don't think it's like you know, the Sherlock Holmes, the black shark or the big black dogs that they have sometimes. I think it's more in terms of you know, maybe like a puma that escaped. But in the 80s, some sheep went missing. Well, no, sorry, didn't get missing. Some sheep were killed. 30 of them were killed on a farm in Devon. And all that was left behind was their skin and head and feet. And then it happened on another farm, and then another farm, and they actually got the Marines out, and they were using live rounds, which in England is unheard of. But people were having sightings of this extremely large, big, black creature. And a woman wrote a book about it called Di Francis, and actually she said, and it's quite controversial, I don't know really, but she said that there was a missing teenager, and she was out on her news round in 1978, and she was doing deliveries, and she got off her bicycle because she saw some friends, and they walked up the hill, and as the hill levelled off, she got back on the bicycle and went off. And when the friends got to where she had been, they just found her bicycle laying on the ground, and the wheel still spinning. But they thought maybe she was just hiding, she was going to jump out on them, but she disappeared. So the whole village were out searching for them, and they got the Marines out, and the helicopters and the dogs, but there was no tracks and no idea of where she could have gone really. But these big, huge black cats, they go back to sort of 2 centuries, really. I mean, in 1906 in Guildford, which is closer to London, 50 sheep were killed in one night and drained of blood and mutilated. But I think in terms of, these are probably not paranormal, I think, but I don't know. There are lots of historic accounts of these big black dogs. The Hellfire Club in Ireland, which was kind of like an occult establishment that aristocrats set up, and they had a big building on a sacred site in Ireland, just outside of Dublin, and there's always reports of black dog sightings there. And they found skeletons buried there. It used to be a black magic sort of place. But actually, I was really just the other day. There was a police inspector in 2012, but he'd only just come out with it and said about it, and it was in a Scottish newspaper. There's a place called Arthur's Seat, which is just outside of Edinburgh, and he was up in a helicopter because they were looking for a missing woman. And it's not a huge rural place. It's not a national park, but it's a mountainous sort of hill. And they had the helicopter's infrared camera searching for her in the dark. and he said he could see this mass, black mass, and it was 3 times the size of the policewoman who was on the ground searching for the woman. And so he said, I just had to radio her and tell her to just walk slowly away, because he thinks it was probably a big black cat. But it's really strange. At Arthur's seat, I was also reading that there's some tiny dolls were found, almost like voodoo dolls that had been buried there about 200 years ago. And they're like little stick men, but they're wearing clothes. But nobody knows why they were buried there or what they're for.
Right. Could tie back into the magic thing. Maybe some phantom cat is being summoned from the ether.
Who knows?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Man, these are all great. Another story that I love that really doesn't fit anywhere else. It just seems pretty unique. It's the case of the Delatov Pass incident. Pretty strange circumstances, but tell us about that one a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably one that a lot of people have heard about, but it was in 1959 when 7 men and 2 women from the Polytechnic there in the Ural Mountains of Russia, they set off to do what was rated as the most dangerous climb. They were all quite experienced hikers, though, but when they didn't return on the expected date, a search party was sent out for them. And when the search party got to where they thought they'd be, they found their tent, which was pitched on the uppermost slope, and it was called the Mountain of the Dead anyway. But they found a slash that had been made from inside the tent, and there were barefoot human tracks going downhill in the snow. Inside the tent, their boots were stacked up in a neat row, and their dinners were there frozen and uneaten. And they found their bodies about a mile away, and they were scattered and half-dressed, no coats on. But they'd all had severe injuries, and the weirdest thing was that they had crushed internal organs. And one of the women, she actually had her tongue removed, and her stomach showed that she had coagulated blood in it, which indicates that your heart is still beating when it happened. So she also had her eyes removed, but there were no external wounds, no scratches or anything else. And the theories over the years have been really that it was in the Cold War era, so maybe it was some kind of nuclear weapon testing because the radiation levels were quite high. But it could have been, prisoners escaping from a gulag, or it could have been wild men or a yeti, but there were no tracks anywhere. And there were reports of strange lights in the sky. But their injuries were really consistent more with a kind of a fall from a height. And other people have said it was an avalanche. I believe somebody came up with a theory about it being infrasound. But I don't know. I mean, I did find recently another case which happened in Argentina on a place called Mount Aconcagua. I'm so sorry. In January 1972, and a team of 8 had set out, and it was the worst month to go because it was absolutely freezing, and they'd been advised not to go there, but they refused, and they took a guide with them, and one by one they all started to turn back because the weather was so adverse. And 2, called Johnson and Cooper, they returned and they were delirious with frostbite. And the guide and the other people there said, where is the remaining people from the party, which was John Cooper and Jeanette Johnson? So there was 2 left out there. And they said, well, Cooper we've left him sitting up by a road, and Jeanette has been taken by a team of women on mules, which it sounded like they were having hallucinations.
Right.
But 2 years later, some climbers came across Jeanette's body, and she'd been preserved in ice, but she'd been brutally beaten. And they came across Cooper, and he was laying down too, and he was also beaten. I suppose you could say, well, was it the 2 other climbers that returned? But I'm presuming that the police cleared them. But they did say that they'd both been murdered. But the thing was, they were up in such an inhospitable area, and because of the time of year, there were no other climbers there. So the kind of mystery there is, well, how did they die? I don't know. Right.
Yeah, both of those stories are interesting. We hear so much about individuals going missing, having a weird experience, but when multiple people go missing or die in the same event, I mean, that is even stranger because people together should be able to, they can work together to get out of the situation, but a large group like that going missing or dying in weird unknown ways is even trippier. I mean, there's another thing in the book you talk about. It's got to be probably one of the biggest groups of missing people. I guess a village of missing Inuits is 30 people apparently just disappeared.
Yeah, they did. Now they went well, there was a trapper. This was in Canada. And there was a trapper, and he used to always go there and just visit the villagers. And he turned up one day, and he thought, well, this is odd because I can't see anybody. But there was about 30 or 40 people that lived there. His name was Joe LaBelle, and there was still food cooking inside their home. So he thought, this is really scary, and he just fled. And he went to find the nearest Mounties, who came back to investigate. But there was no explanation because there was no tracks anywhere. There was nowhere for them really to have gone. And the only thing that people said could have happened in the Inuit belief was that there was a demonic entity, according to Inuit legend, and it's called the Torngarthuk, Torngarthuk. I'm so bad at pronunciation. But it's supposed to be a powerful sky deity, and it has this legion of malevolent spirits under its control. And it's said to be invisible to all but the Inuit shamans, but it can manifest in animal form. So, I mean, again, there's no explanation for that one, but paranormal, I don't know.
It's interesting when strange lore seems to coincide with a strange occurrence. And when it comes to Native American stories, I love the stories of skinwalker cults and human-animal hybrid shapeshifters, and that might be what we're dealing with here. But I was also kind of psyched to see you write about that in its own section, its own chapter, and they are kind of underrepresented stories and very weird. Tell us about a couple of your favorites in that realm that interest you most.
Well, I guess that in terms of the skinwalkers, I think the reason they're so rare is that people don't like to talk about them because there's that belief that, I think anyway, in the Native Americans, there's a belief that if you talk about it, you're almost drawing them to you.
Right.
And it's so few people would ever talk about them. And I really struggled to even find any accounts at all. A guy called Hoss Laws was a teacher living on the Navajo reservation, and he's written a book about it called Skinwalker Shards Linger. And he had explained that he killed a rabid dog that had come into his yard to put it out of its misery, really, because he thought it was really ill. And he went back indoors, and when he came back out again, the dog had gone and there were no tracks in the snow. And he then became violently ill that night, and his wife said, we need to get you to a medicine doctor. But he said, oh, that's silly, you know. But they insisted. They took him there, and a little boy who was a neighbour, he'd gone with them. And he said, I saw this spirit form leave his body as he was being worked on by the medicine man. But, you know, so he sort of, you know, said that that's what's happened despite his skepticism, and that's what he believed happened. But in Malaysia and the Philippines, there's a similar kind of creature as such, and it's called an aswang. And that's more, in terms of its appearance, it seems to be able to take on animal form, but it also has an appearance like a sort of a witch with long, dirty, matted hair and bloodshot eyes and a long black tongue and nails, and it can take a bird form as well, but it has this dreadful smell. And I was reading by Michael Lindemans of the Encyclopedia Mythica. He wrote about his own experience because he lived there as a boy in a small village in the Philippines. And it was surrounded by trees, the village, and he couldn't sleep one night because the neighbours' dogs were barking so much. And he looked out of his bedroom window, and it was a bright moon, and he said he could see something floating horizontally in front of the neighbour's window, but it looked like a person. And the next day he talked to the children next door, and they were really matter of fact, and they just said, well, it was after our mother because she's sick. And their theory is that these entities, they target the ill and the vulnerable. And it's supposed to be able to enter a person's body, and then it uses that body to inflict harm on its enemies. But I found a really fascinating one from South Africa. There's an English guy called Jim Lee Shreve, and he's a voodoo practitioner. But he wrote about this account that actually went into the court. A man was put on trial for it in 1987 because he'd woken up in this rural village. He'd heard scratching noises at his front door. And he'd called out and nobody had answered, so he grabbed hold of his axe and he opened the door, and he thought he could see this huge bat-like creature hanging from the rafters of the roof, and he hit it with the axe, and then he fled next door to the neighbours, and several of them returned. He wanted to show them, you know, what's this thing? And they saw this creature, and it was dragging itself across the yard toward a fence, and he hit it again and again until it stopped moving. But the thing was, in court, because what transpired was that it turned into a man, allegedly. So when it went to court, each witness described it differently. So some said it was a mule-type creature, some said it was a winged creature, but all of them said it changed its form in front of their eyes. So it started off as a creature, but it turned into the body of a child, and then it turned into a fully formed man. Well, it turned out he'd actually killed the local wizard, who was called Jim Nephalama, and he was reputed to be this wizard, and he used to go around the village and tell people, I can do whatever I want to you. And he would say, nobody has got the power apart from me, but I don't work in the daytime, I operate at night, and that's when I fight my battles. But he actually went, it was actually a proper trial in South Africa. And the judge said, well, you should have realised it was the man. But, all the witnesses said, oh, it shifted.
Yeah, that is an interesting element, too. And it's got to be really disconcerting when you think you're beating an animal or shooting an animal and then it turns into a person. I mean, now you're looking at jail time.
Exactly. Yeah, he did. He got manslaughter. Yeah.
Man.
But then it was appealed. Then it was appealed and they reduced his sentence.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
At least he got that out of it. But, man, shapeshifters, skinwalkers, cryptids, I love all that stuff. Another couple stories that you have a section of is jinn encounters or malevolent fairies, which is slightly similar, I suppose. Sometimes I wonder if we're not looking at just different ways of describing the same phenomenon, but things like jinn and these fairies, they have fairly unique characteristics to their encounters, don't they?
Yeah, they do. I mean, some people say it's the archons, and that the archons are the ones who manifest these entities, and they can appear in all these different forms. But then if you look at the Celtic kind of traditions, fairies were very much part of the folklore, but it wasn't really folklore. They actually said that they were having sightings. To them it was real, and it very well may have been. I mean, the jinn are harder. They're almost like the skinwalkers. It's so hard to find accounts of that. Although I have a friend who has told me jinn stories because he comes from the Middle East. And to them, it's totally real, and they get exercise to get it out of them. So, I mean, it's a very strong cultural belief there. But the fairy stories, the fairies are supposed to be elemental spirits, and their natural habitat is said to be the woods and the forests. And the thing about them is that they're supposed to be able to use the power of illusion or glamour so that they can disguise the path in front of you. So you may think you've come to a meadow, but actually they're leading you through something really precarious, and you're going off the edge of a cliff. And the jinn are supposed to be able to take the form of winds or storms. And again, they can cause you accidents. The fairies, they can be invisible, they can manifest. In Ireland, there was newspaper reports in the 70s of these school children saying that they had these apparitions of fairies, and they would chase them, and they would go through the hedges, but there would be they would just go straight through them. They could go through walls, they could go through anything. And in the sort of 1800s, there used to be lots of reports about fairy sightings, and quite strangely, but quite often religious figures, vicars would write about them. And there's one story that was in 1865, and a little boy said that he'd been lured into the forest by some music. And he said that the leaves and the branches parted as he walked, and it was almost like they were opening for him. And he said that he found himself down in this beautiful place where it was all gold, and there was rainbows and deer and a lake, and he was fed and looked after. And he was found a few days later asleep in the woods, but he said a beautiful woman in a gown had taken him to that place. But the one that I think is really, really strange is there was a story about, it's a true story, a lady called Netta Fornerio, and she lived in London in the 1900s, and from a young age she was really, really keen on the growing Victorian spiritualism. And she was obsessed with trying to commune with the spirits of the dead. And she'd actually joined the Alpha and Omega Temple, which was established by Samuel Mathers after he'd been kicked out of the Golden Dawn. And Mathers and Aleister Crowley had this fight for power over it. And it was said that Samuel Mathers had manifested a vampiric entity to attack Crowley, and Crowley had responded by raising demons, and they've had this really fierce spiritual battle. But the actual story about Netta is really sort of incorporates the possibility that she was taken by fairies, because she went off to a tiny remote island in the Hebrides in 1929, and that's off the coast of Scotland, and it's only about 3 miles wide. And at the time there was no electricity, no water, no phones, and she went there for tranquility really. But the legendary English diarist Dr. Samuel Johnson had written about it, and he had said about this really strange, unusual energy that was there. And before him, and it had been founded years and years ago, so in the 7th century, an abbot of the island called Adumnan, he'd written about St. Columba, who the legend had it could control the weather and the island, and he could keep the dragons and the serpents away. But the monk wrote about his encounters with fairies and angelic visitations. So she'd gone there anyway for this extended stay. She'd left London, gone on her own, and she found lodgings with a family there. And it turns out that she used to spend her day in the bedroom, and at night she would roam the moors on her own and then come home in the early hours. And it seems that she would just spend all day writing in a journal, but nobody really knew what she did at night. But her behaviour began to get really disturbing because the family noticed that her jewellery and her fingernails had turned black. But in the daytime, she seemed to have this really faraway trance sort of expression. She wasn't focused at all. She was just glazed. But they left her to it. But then one day she became really distressed, and she said to the family, "I've got to leave. I've got to get back to London immediately." And she said that she was being disturbed by people telepathically, and she was receiving messages from other worlds. But the thing was, on that island, it was a Sunday, and the boat didn't go to the mainland on a Sunday. So the mother said, "Well, we'll take all your belongings and we'll take you down to the harbour, and you can wait there for the ferry for the next day." So she went back to her room and she packed, and then she came out and she said to them, "No, it's okay, I've changed my mind." And later, the mother, Mrs. McRae, she described her as having this look of resignation about her, and she spoke as if it was an inevitability. You know, she'd resigned herself to her fate. Well, the next afternoon, the mother realised that she hadn't seen her for the whole day, so she knocked on her door and there was no answer, and she went in. All of her belongings were in there, but the room was empty. And in her fireplace was a manuscript, and she'd burnt it all. And they were concerned for her mental state, so they set out across the island, and it's only 1 mile by 3 miles wide. But they spent the whole day searching for her on the moors. They didn't find her, so the next day they looked again and they still didn't find her. So they sent somebody over to the mainland to get a policeman, and they brought him back. And then the next day they went out again, and the son found her lying dead. She was naked apart from a long dark robe, and it had occult figures in the lapel. And she was lying over a piece of grass on a mound, but she'd carved a cross into the earth underneath her. And it was said that in her left hand she had this long knife that she held, and her face was supposed to have been in an expression of terror, you know, a death mask. But she had these fierce scratches all over her body. The doctor couldn't determine the time of death. But the weird thing as well was that her toes were all cut because she was barefoot. Her toes were cut. And it seemed to indicate that she'd been running across the rocks and the rough ground there. So maybe, you know, was she being chased, or what was she running from? But the soles of her feet were completely clean and there was no damage to them. So they were thinking, well, how did she manage to walk all around the island for 2 days like that? And her death was ruled as exposure, obviously. But her good friend, Bjorn Fortune, who was part of the Alpha and Omega organisation, she said, well, Moina Mathers, the wife of Samuel Mathers, has killed her. And they thought, well, how? Because she's dead. And she said, well, it was a psychic astral attack. Because, you know, Crowley and Mathers had this battle going on.
Right.
But the thing was, and also, of course, the mistresses of Crowley, 4 of them, had killed themselves. So it was sort of, well, had they been killed by some kind of ritual summoning? Because Mathers himself had said, you know, I can summon the demon Beelzebub, but I'm warning you all that if you don't take pristine care in your ritual, it will kill you or you'll self-destruct, you know. So there was a thought, well, has she somehow been killed on an astral attack? Is that even possible? But the thing is, Netta also, back in London, she used to write reviews for the Occult Review. So she was obsessed, apparently, by the writings of Fiona MacLeod, who was actually a man called William Sharp, and he was a Scottish poet, and he wrote under this pen name. And she went to see this opera called The Immoral Hour, and she went to see it about 30 times. She was obsessed with it, and then she'd write a review about it. And The Immoral Hour is about fairies and folk and fairy magic. And she describes the fairies in that as a breed of strong immortals that humans are in awe of, but they fear because of their ability to interfere and manipulate with people. So, in her review, it actually mentioned the dangers of opening yourself up to the fairy realms because of what could happen. And she called them a dark atavism, which is sort of, saying ancestrally that they're very dark beings. They have no human empathy. And so she seemed to be really aware of the danger of dabbling in this. But Moira Matthews also pointed out that she stopped working with Nettie in their occult workings because she was so obsessed and she was dabbling in this obsession with trying to contact the green ray elemental, which is supposed to be one of in the esoteric belief where you've got all these different rays, and the green ray elementals, they come from Gnosticism and Theosophy, and the rays are a type of light where matter is comprised of waves and energy and thought to have created the universe. So the green ray is believed to be on a substrata of this etheric, these planes, but it's on a higher plane than the sort of demonic planes. So the idea was that maybe she was trying to, communicate and go towards this fairy realm. And it turns out that the writer that she was so obsessed with as well, he had also spent some time on the island, and he'd lived there, he'd been brought up there, and he had gone one day to see his best friend, Elsie, and she disappeared. And her mother said, well, she's gone to the fairy mound because she believes that the monks from the island are trying to kill her. They're threatening her. I mean, the dead monks. So she'd gone to the only place where the monks couldn't access, which was this fairy mound, and that was where she was found dead. So there was all this fairy lore. But on the other hand, at the time that when she was found dead there was a report of a black hooded, robed figure that was found with her. Wandering around, but there was also UFO lights in the sky, and so again, it's kind of, well, what the heck happened,
Right. All kinds of elements tie in there.
Yeah.
And I do love stories of things that fit the description of fairies or gnomes or elves or goblins or some type of mystical humanoids that might be screwing with humanity from the shadows. I think that's a really compelling idea because in the conspiracy world, we're always looking at who's at the top of the pyramid. And, if you look at it, the possibility of a non-human element, a lot of people talk about a partnership between alien races and the global elite. But what if, we're dealing with some type of mystical entities that are based on the earth that are just not something we understand, and they kind of pull us like puppet strings whenever they decide they get bored?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's a lot to do with the vibration and energy, and the fact that, we're a certain denseness, aren't we? And they're a different kind of denseness, so they're much lighter, and they can come and sort of flitter into our world and go out again. And, I forget which book, I think Something in the Woods, I do a really big section on invisible entities, and there are so many accounts of people having some kind of encounter with things where they can only hear the footsteps, or they're invisible type entities. Well, they obviously exist, but you can't see them, so they're coming from some other dimension that they're coming into ours because they shift their density. It's a hard thing to grasp, but then if you can grasp it, it makes complete sense. I mean, to me, I'm really, really very keen on the idea of life after death and near-death experiences and afterlife communication. That's a fascination for me.
Yeah.
And some of those accounts kind of, because to me it kind of validates the existence of our soul after death, I find it harder to believe that these entities can come into our world as well, if that makes sense.
It does, and I'm not sure either. I kind of assume that if you can go one way, you've got to be able to do something to go the other way too, but who knows?
Exactly.
I wish science studied it a little bit more, but we talked about the idea of negative fairies and entities and jinn. Let's talk about the flip side. There are stories of people being helped by spirits when they're kind of lost and alone in the woods, aren't there? Yeah,
there's some really good ones. One of my favorite ones actually is there's quite a famous story, and it's sort of called Michael of the Morning, and there was a reverend called Walter Mouldy, and he gave a talk to some Marines on the naval base at San Diego in 1950, and he read a letter out, and it had been given to him by a young Marine, and it was based in the Korean War. And the Reverend Walter Mouldy, he said, I corroborate this. I've spoken to the boy, and this is what happened. And the letter itself was to the boy's mother, and he said, something's happened to me. I don't dare tell anybody else for fear that they're just going to ridicule me, but I have to tell you. And before he'd left for the war, he'd his mother had said to him, you know that prayer, Michael, Michael of the morning, I want you to say it every day. And he was writing back to her, and he was saying to her, I said that prayer every day, but I need to tell you what happened. And he said that one day they were sent out on patrol, and it was in the winter, and he's walking along, and he suddenly sees this man standing next to him, this huge Marine, he's about 6'5", and he thought, well, I don't recognise you. And he said to him, hi, who are you? And he said, I'm Michael. And he said, well, that's my name too. And he said, I know. And then this big Marine started reciting the prayer that he said every day. And he said, I don't understand this. I don't know you, but I know everybody else in my unit. Anyway, then it started getting really misty. And he thought, well, the man next to me, I can't see his breath, but it's really misty and cold. Anyway, the Marine said to him, there's going to be some trouble up ahead. And a snowstorm came in, and so they couldn't see anything at all. But when it cleared, they found themselves standing face to face with the enemy, with the Korean soldiers. So the Michael that wrote the letter, he just grabbed hold of the big guy, and he ducked down, but he got hit as he so he ducked down. But the big guy, Michael, who he didn't know, he refused to get down, and he got up to try and pull him down, and he got shot. And then he said all he could remember was being held by this huge soldier. And then the soldier got back up, and he said he seemed to grow in presence, and he had this terrible splendour on his face, and it looked like he had these huge wings that were glowing, and in his hand he had a sword. And then he passed out, and he woke up in hospital, and the sergeant of the unit came to see him, and he said, how did you kill all of those soldiers? And the soldier in bed, the Marine Michael, he said, what do you mean? And he said, you killed each one with a single stroke of the sword.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. And then he said, who was that guy that was with me? And he said, Michael. And he goes, you're the only Michael. So I love that story.
Yeah.
But there's loads of others. Frank Smythe was trying to climb Everest and with a group, and it was 1933, and he'd got up 26,000 feet, and he had about 1,000 feet left to go. And the oxygen at that level is almost enough to, you're going to die virtually. And he thought, I've got to make it. And he thought, okay, it's just me, I'm going to do it. And he pulled out his last remaining piece of food, which was a biscuit, and he broke it in half, and he gave it to the man with him. And when he got back to base, he was writing in his journal, and he said, I can't believe it. I thought somebody was with me all that time, but nobody was there with me. And then a woman called Chantal Lakey, she'd written into Newsweek in 1993, and she said that she was up on a mountain trail in Pacific Highway 101, and she was with her fiancé, and he said, I want to show you this tremendous scenic route if you come up the mountains. So they'd climbed up, and it was really beautiful, but now they were going to get down, and he chose to come down via a path which was almost like an animal trail. And the thing was, it started to rain as well, and it was loose shale, and they were trying to get down, and he was turning around occasionally to try, to help her. And as he turned around one more time, he fell. He fell off the mountainside and obviously died. And she froze in terror. She didn't know what to do. But she said, I had no faith. I didn't believe in God at all. But all of a sudden, I prayed, and all of a sudden, it was almost as though the gateway between heaven and the angels just I don't know, it opened up, and I saw these angels all around me, and they got me down the mountain. And when the rescue people came, they said, well, there's no way we would go down that path. We wouldn't do it even with our equipment. But she had somehow managed to get down the bottom, and, in her opinion, they had brought her down. And there was a journalist called Bill Burt, and he used to travel the country, covering stories as a reporter. And some scouts in Scotland, and they'd gone missing on a mountain, and he'd been sent to cover the story, but it's about a 6-hour journey from London, so by the time he got there, they'd been found. But he thought, well, I'll talk to the boys anyway, and they can tell me what happened to them. And they said to him, well, we were lost, we didn't know what to do. But then we saw this woman in this long white gown, and she was beckoning to us. So we followed her, and she took us to the search party. So Bill Burt, the reporter, he thought, well, that's amazing. And he went to talk to the rescue party, and he said, did you hear what the boys said? And they said, well, of course there was no woman up on the mountain. It was snowing. It was freezing cold. No way. But, I mean, there's hundreds of stories like this, you know, they're just incredible. And to the people that were there at the time, you probably could never convince them that it didn't happen. So, you know, there's a psychologist, I think it's called Peter Sudfeld, and he calls it the second person syndrome. It's almost as if your subconscious conjures up this image. But I don't know, I tend to think that actually they were probably helped.
Right. I mean, both are compelling ideas. The idea that it's some psychological effect is possible. I mean, trauma-based mind control is well known for creating multiple personalities.
Yeah.
I mean, within a body, I guess it's possible you could have one without. Although you'd think if that was something that was common, it would happen to people that are in like solitary confinement pretty regularly. And I don't know. I don't know that I would say it's a psychological manifestation. It seems legit. I mean, people have negative encounters all the time. Why shouldn't there be some positive ones?
Yeah, absolutely. It would even the scales up a bit, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So I love, along with the goblins and the fairies and those types of elvish entities, I like them because apparently they seem more earth-based and probably underground. The stories of underground creatures and bases are pretty fascinating to me, and that seems to be the explanation given for some of the disappearances in this forest in Puerto Rico, I think, which is pretty strange, and some of the strange cases there kind of point to an underground manipulation of some kind, doesn't it?
It really does. It was Scott Corrales, who's a fantastic researcher, seems to cover sort of the Latin American places. And he was writing about El Yunque National Forest, which is dubbed a place that has a dark side that involves human disappearances. In 1973, 9 campers, students and their leaders, including a man called Ramos. I'm just going to run. He was, so they were heading up a mountain trail to camp there for the night. And they met 3 men coming down the trail. And one of the students was taking pictures at the time. And they noticed, well, they looked like humans, but they were all dressed exactly the same. And their features on their face seemed to be identical as well. But they didn't really think anything of it. And but when the film was developed later, there was just a mist where those 3 people had been. So that was a bit strange. But it got weirder because that night they were all camped up and suddenly they found themselves surrounded by 5, which they said vaguely humanoid figures. But they were darting around really, really fast through the vegetation. And they said they had claw-like hands and elongated ears. But what they did as well was they blocked the trail that was the only way down for the campers to escape. And they said they had triangular-shaped heads. But all night they circled them, but they were going at astonishing speeds. And he wrote that one of the group started hitting himself on the head with his flashlight because he was so terrified he just wanted to knock himself out. But there's loads and loads of reports there. There's an ex-Navy officer, Jorge Martin, and he runs a radio show called Ovnis Confidential, and he's now a ufologist. And he said, you know, we've seen craft emerging and going into the sea, and we've seen them going to the side of the mountain base. They've been there for years, you know, we know that they're there. But in the 70s as well, a group of school children, an investigator called Hermes Rivera had written about some children, and they'd all disappeared on a school trip. And the police turned to a psychic, which sometimes they do, and he said, well, they're no longer in this physical dimension. And it was reported that the teacher killed himself over it because, you know, he was so distraught that all these children disappeared. And two soldiers had disappeared from the naval base security point as well. So there's lots and lots of accounts. And the authorities tend to sort of say, well, I think they've just disappeared into sinkholes. But then they say, well, actually, they weren't anywhere near the sinkholes when they went missing. But it's known, really, for really weird creatures and really weird disappearances, but a UFO hotspot as well.
Yeah, what a strange place.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild. Another thing people scoff at, and of course, whenever I go on a show as a guest, they always make a crack about reptilians, but there seems to be some actual stories of encounters with reptilian-like beings that you've dug up out there, aren't there?
There are a lot. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of people who say that they've been abducted by them. Yeah, I know. And it's not a new thing, is it? It's been going on for years and years in terms of accounts coming out about it. John Rhodes is probably one of the authorities on it. I mean, I'm not an authority on it, that's for sure. But John Rhodes, he calls himself the alien hunter, but he's, of a firm belief that there's reptilian bases under the national parks, like Dulce. And he says, worldwide, the legends tell of an underworld inhabited by these mystical beings of varied forms, which, and I believe to this day that they're still underground. That's what he says. And then you look at things like the Thomas Costello, which is a really old story of a security guard that said he worked in Dulce. And he came across these lizard-like upright reptilians. John Carpenter as well I don't know if he still is, but he was a director of MUFON, and he's a psychiatric therapist. So he has interviewed people and had these testimonies from them, and the accounts are all the same. Where they say that they've encountered reptilians, and they're always bigger than 7 foot, lizard scales, human snake type face, almond eyes, vertical slits in their eyes, no lips, but very, very muscular, but they can shapeshift. So the idea is that they can impose a hologram of a human face onto theirs, but they use mind control to sort of drain your energy and make you do what they want you to do. There's a woman called Kay Kiziar who says that she was abducted under the Superstition Mountains and taken down into this base where there was these beings in dark robes and, using them as slaves, but using them up on the surface as slaves after they'd mind controlled them. I mean, Thomas Costello, he said that when he worked there in the base, and, I don't know if it's true or not, but he said that it was a government military base, but there were people in cages, so human beings had been abducted, taken underground, and they're used in experiments, and they're turned into, hybrid monsters that are kept in cages, and when they're no use anymore, they're just fed to the reptilians and eaten, which, it all sounds really, really, really ridiculous, but on the other hand, if you've had that encounter, I don't think you would say it was. It's really down to, if you have these kind of experiences, then you believe it, I mean, in the UK, probably as in your country as well, but we have a person called Miles Johnson. He's been studying this for years, about 20-odd years, and he had a similar kind of security guard testimony from a guy called Barry King. Now, he's on YouTube, it's called the Bases Project. And the idea with these bases, supposedly in England, is that they're military bases underground, but it's not so much that the reptilians are in control, but it's more like the military government are in control, and they've generated these programmed life forms that they now use to do their bidding. So it's more like we're in control of them. And he was saying that he came across all these creatures. And it goes further because they say that whistleblowers that have come out, say that they were taken down as children and used in experiments, mind-controlled, like you said about the fractured personalities, and weaponized to remote view people, to kill them, also using occult ritual to enhance their power, but they can, got the power to remotely view people, kill them. I mean, it goes way into sort of the land of sci-fi. I don't know much about sci-fi because I've never read a sci-fi book, but you could say, well, this is the stuff that films are made of, but then there's also so many whistleblowers that say, well, actually, this is what's going on. But talking of what John Rhodes said about these mystical beings underground, in my last book I was writing about Malta, the island, Malta.
Yes.
Well, there's an archaeologist called Graham Stewart, and he made the statement that mythological creatures exist and the governments have known for such a long time, and they're actually fed humans. And what happened in the early 1900s was that a group of labourers were digging a well, and they accidentally discovered excavations that led them down into multi-level catacombs. And down there they found 7,000 skeletons. And a lady who worked at the British Embassy called Lila Jessup, she had gone on a guided tour of these catacombs, and against the advice of the guide, she'd snuck off into one of the little chambers. And she'd gone through it, and she found that it led her out into this almost bottomless cave, this huge area. And she claimed that when she looked opposite her, she saw these beings emerge, and they were extremely tall, and they were wearing cowls over them, and they had long white hair. And she said that they beckoned with their fingers to her, and there was a huge wind, so she literally just ran as fast as she could back out. And she said that she saw the guide and looked at him, and she was about to tell him, but he gave her a look that told her he already knew what she'd seen. Yeah, but she wrote about her experience to a journal called Borderland Science, to the editor called Crab Riley. And she mentioned that a group of school children and their teachers had gone missing inside the catacombs prior to her visit a few years before. And she thought, well, the story was that the cave the wall had caved in. So they had been trapped inside. Well, they were searched for weeks, but they were never found. So it's supposed to be a true story. But Crab Riley of the journal, he thought, well, I don't know, is there any evidence for this? So he spent weeks looking for the evidence of this story. And he found it in a National Geographic article. And it said that these children had gone missing and they'd been searched for, and they had to give up in the end because they couldn't find them. But the article that he read about the children missing was written by another archaeologist called William Griffith, and he had called the actual place there a restaurant for the Atlantean descendants, and actually he said that 30,000 skeletons were found under there.
Wow.
Yeah, but what's interesting, a guy called Dustin Nace has done some research on caves in America, and he said there's 700 caves and tunnels in the Lava Beds National Park alone, and there's about 150 in Marble Mountain, with about 30 miles mapped. So, I mean, there is a possibility. So it's not so much that they're alien-type creatures, but they're an ancient race that are down underground. There's that idea.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It definitely does. It definitely does. Wow, Steph, I mean, I just love these stories. We covered a lot of ground here. We kind of ran through them in a pretty rapid-fire fashion, but, I mean, you got so many good stories in these books, so many I hadn't heard before, which is always a treat, but I'd say we also left out way more than we included, so anyone who wants more, definitely check out Steph's books, and maybe we should tell people where to get them and clarify that you write these under a pen name as well, right?
Yeah, I do. So on Amazon, they're called Stephen Young. So I write under a pen name, which is Stephen Young.
Gotcha.
But they're on Amazon.
Yeah, all great. About a dozen there, covering subjects that we didn't even get into, like real demon encounters and haunted places. Very good stuff. All Kindle, all pretty reasonably priced too. So very awesome. Well, Steph, it has been a blast. I love these kind of shows, a series of strange stories to tell around the digital campfire, and I really appreciate you being here. So take care of yourself and keep up the great work, all right?
Thank you so much, Greg. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
You got it. Have a good one out there.
You too.
Rock me like a hurricane, Higherside Chatters. I hope you like that show. It's nice to hear a female voice once in a while, and Steph definitely had great recall for her work. I don't think any of her ebooks are over $5, and they're great if you have a 20-hour layover in Moscow like I just did. I did want to say a little more about the Armenia trip. I did talk to Graham about doing THC, and I think we're going to be setting something up for early November, right before he does Joe Rogan, and that should be a great time. I did get some awesome footage and information about these sites. We saw a pyramid that had been buried, petroglyphs that are thought to be 12,000 years old, visited Karahunj, which is largely thought to be the world's first observatory, sort of like a Stonehenge type of place with perfect drill holes that frame Sirius and Orion at key points of the year. Pretty amazing place. Think of it as a calendar that works like a cosmic sundial. Another place, Vartnats, was known as an ancient ritual space, and I climbed down into a sacrificial pit. Who knows how many people have been burned there? And when we were checking out an excavation site, I found a human jaw that still had teeth in it, probably my first time touching parts of a dead human, and one that might be several thousand years old, no less. So, interesting stuff. I will be putting the footage up when I can. I still have some catching up to do. 2 more shows to get done before we close out the month. I have 2 more on the books. Hopefully they go off without a hitch, and then I can start working on the Armenia stuff that I will have available on the Plus site. Speaking of Plus, you know your signups make my world go round, but it's also just twice as much show for you. The last show with Richard Casaro was pretty good. I hope everyone heard that show. And also before that one, I did one with Crow and James Alfred. A 2-guest show doesn't happen all that often, and that was also a personal favorite. And also, I think Richard Merrick right before that was on another level. The Venus Blueprint, the psychedelic component to the past, compelling stuff. And of course today, what did Steph and I talk about in the second hour after a pretty solid first? Well, we talked about places that compel people to commit suicide and the possible quartz connection. We talked a lot about the black goo conspiracy. I've been hearing this more and more, but Steph has written about it. This seemingly sentient alien puddle of goo that the Black Project stumbled upon, apparently. We also talked about several great cases of possible time travel from her book on the subject, of course, John Teeter, but also Sean Day and a time slip to a futuristic city, sound and frequency, the time travel craft of Afghanistan, and several other great stories. Just go to the HighersideChatsPlus.com, sign up for the $5 a month, read the frequently asked questions page for the best apps and listening methods for your devices, and enjoy the extra hour of weird, sometimes educational, always out there interviews with the best guests in the alternative world. That's my pitch. Speaking of John Teeter, I did have somebody email me a couple months back, and I posted this on the Plus forums because I didn't know where to put it, but somebody contacted me, and they said that they believed without a shadow of a doubt that their father was John Teeter. They never knew their father. Their mother always kept it a bit of a secret. And through his own research and digging, he concluded it was John Teeter. He asked me if I wanted to hear the full story. He was reluctant to share. I said yes, I did. I never heard from him again. So I don't know what was up with that. But since we talked about John Teeter today, I figured I'd mention it. Anyway, you are all awesome. Let me know if anyone has any further problems with the feed, but 10 hours of tech support and $900 later, I think we're over the worst of it, and it shouldn't happen again. I was sorry to see so many people lose faith in me so fast. It's a little disheartening, and I know that's obviously not the majority, it's just the loudest voices in the room, but we've been doing this show for almost 5 years, and I don't think I've ever steered anybody wrong yet, and to get 3 or 4 dozen people jumping to the conclusion that this is all part of an elaborate ruse on my part, or that I quit the show, or that by me going on Jericho I'd lost all credibility. I heard a lot of crazy stuff this past 2 weeks, but I hope the greater majority understand that I got no tricks up my sleeve. I'm just doing my thing, and I promise you I wouldn't ever undermine your intelligence with a money-making scheme or any kind of marketing stunt, or try to drum up some drama or attention by publicizing a minor cyber attack. You won't hear me screaming from the rafters about doom and gloom, all these things that have really poisoned the well for conspiracy shows and alternative hosts. Everyone says they're different. Everyone ends up being the same. I totally get it. It's why I started this show. But I'm trying to be the exception to the rule. I have full control over the project, and I'm pretty sure as long as I'm alive, I'll be doing 5 shows a month as long as people are listening. And you'll never see me get sponsors, ever. I've been asked by 3 or 4 big podcast advertisers since the Jericho show if I'd be interested, and I will not do it. THC Plus is doing just fine. I think it's the most fair. I think it creates the best show. And those who scoff at the model, well, just remember, you are not hearing about NatureBox or LegalZoom or Audible.com for 10 minutes every show, and consider that worth something. I'm in this for the long haul. I'm just trying to be open, honest, and focus on the guest, which is what I think is important, and have a good time doing it. Boom. So that's it from me today. The triumphant return. 2 more shows coming at you in the next 8 days, and I'll see you then. Your move, underground overlords, interfering entities, and skinwalkers of the secret order. Your frickin' move. Now here's another THC Twisted cover by my man Nick Tetrault. Peace.
I got a new life, you would hardly recognize me. I'm so glad, now I'm amazing. I don't care about you. Why do I bother?